Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into the foundation of British North America today. Specifically, we're looking at that critical period between 1607 and 1692. Yeah, this is when the early settlers arrived, and the sources really emphasize they had no notion of founding a new nation at all.
Not at all. They were thinking much more locally, much more immediate concerns.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really understand how these original 13 colonies developed almost right away into two radically different societies, the Chesapeake and New England. We want to trace the cause and effect here, demographics, labor, politics, all the things that created these really distinct regional identities and, frankly, set the stage for a lot of future conflict.
And it's so important to remember the bigger picture. By 1700, the British presence, geographically, it was actually pretty small compared to Spain, still focused on gold and silver, or France with its huge inland empire built on beaver pelts. The British colonies were different. And we're going to unpack the two very different directions taken by the Chesapeake colonies, that's Virginia and Maryland, and then contrast that with New England.
Okay, so let's dive in where the trouble really started.
Yeah.
The Chesapeake. When you read about early life there, the sources use this phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. And it really wasn't an exaggeration, was it?
No, it's grimly accurate. You're talking about malaria, dysentery, typhoid.
Sure.
These diseases just ravaged newcomers. They cut about 10 years off the life expectancy compared to England.
10 years. That's significant.
It's huge. And the stats are just, well, they're horrifying. Half the people born in the early Chesapeake didn't even make it to age 20.
Half. Wow.
Yeah. And that extreme mortality shaped everything. Society couldn't grow naturally through families having kids. It relied almost completely on fresh immigration.
And who are these immigrants typically?
Mostly single young men, late teens, early 20s, arriving alone, looking for opportunity, however harsh.
So not families coming over together.
Very rarely, especially early on. In 1650, men outnumbered women almost 6-to-1. Think about what that does to society.
Yeah, I mean, families must have been incredibly fragile.
Extremely. Most marriages ended within 7 years because one partner died. Very few children ever got to know a grandparent. It just wasn't a feature of life there.
So it sounds less like a settled community and more like a sort of rough temporary work camp almost.
In many ways, yes, it fostered this utilitarian culture, really focused on immediate profit, which of course ties directly into the economy.
Right, tobacco. That was the engine, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The climate was perfect for it,
Yeah.
and production just exploded. By the end of the 17th century, they were exporting almost 40 million pounds a year.
40 million pounds. But didn't that flood the market?
It did. It depressed prices significantly, but the response wasn't, okay, let's plant less. It was, we need to plant more acres to make up for the lower price.
Which creates other problems.
Two huge ones. First, tobacco absolutely exhausts the soil. It just strips it of nutrients. So you have this constant, insatiable demand for new land, as the sources put it.
And pushing further inland means?
Conflict. Fierce, often brutal conflict with Native American populations whose lands they were encroaching upon. It was an immediate and violent consequence of the tobacco economy.
Okay, so we have this deadly environment, a transient, mostly male population, and a crops that demands endless land and endless labor. But you said families weren't providing the labor, and obviously the Native Americans weren't a viable workforce for them. So how did they solve this huge labor shortage?
They engineered a system, a structural solution called the headright system.
Headright system. Okay, what was that?
Basically, it granted 50 acres of land to whoever paid the passage for a laborer to come across the Atlantic.
Ah, so the person paying got the land, not the worker.
Exactly. That's the crucial point. The master, the person wealthy enough to fund the passage, got the land grant. It immediately concentrated land ownership in the hands of those who already had capital.
So it built inequality right into the system from the start.
Precisely. And the people whose passage was being paid, the vast majority were indentured servants.
Right, I've heard that term. What did that entail?
By 1700, indentured servants made up more than 3/4 of all European immigrants to Virginia and Maryland. They essentially signed a contract mortgaging their labor usually for 4 to 7 years in exchange for the boat trip over.
And what were they supposed to get at the end?
Freedom dues. Theoretically, this included some corn, maybe a suit of clothes, and importantly, the promise of land. A small plot to start their own life.
Ah, the promise of land. But I sense a but coming.
A big but. As the decades wore on, the best land, especially the fertile riverfront land, was snapped up by the established planters using that headright system.
So the masters became less willing to give up valuable land as freedom dues.
Exactly. They became increasingly resistant. So this system started producing not independent farmers, but a growing class of landless, poor
The
freemen.
freemen who had served their time but had, well, nowhere to go and broken dreams.
And they were often armed, they were discontented. Governor William Berkeley of Virginia saw the danger. He lamented governing a place where, he said, 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. The whole situation was a powder keg.
Ready to explode. And it did, didn't it, with Bacon's rebellion?
It did in 1676, led by a young, ambitious planter named Nathaniel Bacon.
What sparked it? It wasn't just poverty, was it?
No, the immediate trigger was Governor Berkeley's Indian policy. There had been brutal attacks by some Native American groups on the frontier settlements, but Berkeley refused to retaliate forcefully.
Why not? Weren't those his people being attacked?
Yes, but Berkeley had a very profitable monopoly on the fur trade with some of those same Native American groups.
Ah, so the frontiersman saw it as corruption, protecting his own profits over their safety.
Precisely. They felt abandoned, betrayed, and they coveted the Indian lands themselves. So Bacon, he rallied this sort of coalition.
Right.
Disgruntled former servants, landless freemen, even some resentful servants still under contract.
A real mix of the discontented.
Absolutely. And this rabble, as Berkeley called them, they lashed out. They attacked Native Americans, both hostile and friendly tribes, indiscriminately. They chased Berkeley out of Jamestown, the capital, and then they burned it to the ground.
Wow. So a full-blown civil war among the colonists.
For a time, yes, it was chaotic and violent. It only ended when Bacon himself suddenly died of disease, likely dysentery. Without its leader, the rebellion collapsed.
And Berkeley's response.
Brutal. He crushed the remaining rebels, hanging over 20 of them, but the damage was done.
How so? What was the long-term impact?
Bacon's rebellion was a wake-up call for the planter elite. It vividly demonstrated the danger of having this large, armed, potentially rebellious population of poor white men in their midst.
The former indentured servants.
Exactly. They realized they needed a different labor force, one that was permanent, more easily controlled, and, crucially, easily identifiable as separate and subordinate.
And this leads directly to the shift towards African slavery.
It's a major catalyst. You see, the elite consciously decided that to maintain social stability among whites, they needed to draw a clear line between freedom and unfreedom. And that line started to run decisively along the color line.
Are there economic factors too?
Oh, definitely. Several things converged. Wages were actually rising back in England, so fewer poor English folk were willing to gamble on indentured servitude.
So the supply of servants was shrinking.
Right. At the same time, mortality rates in the colonies were starting to improve slightly. This made investing in an enslaved person, which was a much larger upfront cost, seem less risky than before. You were more likely to get decades of labor out of them.
Makes grim economic sense.
And then you had new labor-intensive crops emerging, particularly rice in the Carolinas, which demanded a large, stable workforce. All these factors, combined with the fear after Bacon's rebellion, pushed the colonies towards relying on enslaved Africans.
When did that shift really take hold?
By the mid-1680s, black slaves were already outnumbering white servants among the new arrivals in the Chesapeake. And then, a key moment. In 1698, the Royal African Company, which had held a monopoly on the English slave trade, lost that monopoly.
Opening the floodgates.
Absolutely. American traders, especially from places like Rhode Island, jumped into the horrific but lucrative business. The number of enslaved Africans brought directly to North America surged.
And we have to talk about the journey itself, the Middle Passage.
Yes. It's essential to acknowledge the sheer horror. Out of maybe 11 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic, only about 400,000 ended up in North America. Directly, the rest went primarily to the Caribbean and South America.
But the voyage itself.
Was catastrophic, dehumanizing, packed onto ships in unimaginable conditions. Disease ran rampant. The sources estimate death rates were as high as 20% on the voyage alone. 20%.
Just horrific.
Yeah.
And once they arrived, their status was legally defined.
Increasingly so. As the enslaved population grew, so did the fear among the white colonists. This led to the creation of slave codes. Virginia enacted the first comprehensive ones around 1662, and other colonies followed.
What did these codes do?
They established the ironclad legal framework for chattel slavery. They declared that enslaved people, and crucially their children, were chattel's legal property, like livestock for life.
For life. And their children, too.
Yes. Slavery became hereditary. The codes stripped away any human rights, conversion to Christianity. That explicitly did not grant freedom. And in many places, it even became a crime to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Control was paramount.
So looking at the society this created in the South, it sounds incredibly hierarchical.
Extremely. At the very top, you had a small, powerful aristocracy of great planters. These are the famous FFVs, First Families of Virginia, names like Washington, Lee, Fitzhugh.
But they weren't like European nobles, right? They didn't have
Oh,
titles.
no, their power wasn't based on ancient lineage. It was based purely on land, vast amounts of it, and the wealth generated by enslaved labor, primarily through tobacco. And they absolutely dominated politics.
And beneath them.
You had the largest group, the small farmers, maybe owning a few slaves or none at all. Then came the landless whites, former indentured servants, often struggling on the fringes. And at the very bottom, the enormous and growing population of enslaved Africans who underpinned the entire economic structure.
It sounds like a very dispersed society, too. Not many towns or cities.
Very few. Life was quite isolated on the plantations and farms. Charleston in South Carolina was really the only significant city in the South during this period.
Okay, so that's the Chesapeake and the emerging South. Now let's make that pivot you mentioned earlier. Let's contrast this with New England. The difference is just stark, isn't it?
Night and day, really. First off, the environment. New England was much healthier. Clean water, cooler temperatures, fewer tropical diseases like malaria.
And that affected lifespan.
Dramatically. New England settlers lived, on average, to about 70 years old. Think about that compared to the Chesapeake, where half didn't make it to 20.
70. That's basically a modern lifespan almost.
Close to it for the time. And this had huge social consequences. People migrated to New England not as single men, but typically as families.
As whole family units.
Yes. They came to build communities often centered around their Puritan faith. And because people lived so long, the population grew mainly through natural increase, families having children, not constant immigration like the South.
And the long lives meant
Grandparents. The sources actually credit New England's longevity with essentially inventing grandparents in America. Children grew up knowing their elders, which created much more social stability.
that stability must have impacted things like women's rights too, but maybe in complex ways.
It did. It's a bit counterintuitive. Because families were so fragile in the South, there were actually, in some ways, stronger legal traditions allowing married women to retain separate property rights or inheritances. It was a practical measure when husbands died frequently.
Okay, that makes sense.
But in New England, with its stable, patriarchal families, the Puritans worried that separate property rights for women might undermine what they called marital unity.
They wanted the husband firmly in control of the family's assets.
Generally, yes. So, women usually gave up their property rights when they married. However, it's not entirely one-sided. Puritan laws did offer women protections against abusive husbands, and they carved out significant autonomy in certain roles.
Like what?
Midwifery is the classic example. Delivering babies was almost exclusively a female domain, giving women a respected and vital role in the community.
So a different kind of social structure altogether. And you mentioned communities. How were New England towns physically set up?
Much more orderly than the scattered plantations of the South. New towns were legally chartered by the colonial authorities. Land was usually granted to a group of proprietors who then laid out the town.
What did they look like?
Typically, they centered around a meeting house. This building was crucial. It served as both the church for worship and the town hall for government meetings. Often there was a village green nearby for militia drills or grazing livestock. Homes were clustered more closely together.
That physical structure seems to reflect their values. Community, religion, government, all intertwined.
Absolutely. And education was a massive priority for them.
Why education specifically?
For the Puritans, literacy was essential. They believed everyone needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves. This wasn't just a nice to have, it was a core religious requirement.
Did they legislate that?
They did. The Massachusetts School Law of 1647 is a landmark. It required any town with more than 50 families to provide an elementary school to ensure children learned to read.
50 families. That's
Yeah.
a pretty low threshold. They were serious about it.
Very serious. And think about Harvard College, founded way back in 1636, just 6 years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established. Its primary purpose initially, to train ministers, ensuring a literate clergy.
And politically. This town structure fostered a different kind of politics too.
Yes, it fostered a remarkable degree of local democracy, at least for the time. The participatory town meeting became the cornerstone of New England government.
How did that work?
Adult male property owners in the town would gather in the meeting house, discuss local issues, taxes, roads, schools, and vote directly. It was a form of direct democracy that was quite radical. Thomas Jefferson later called it the best school of political liberty the world ever saw.
Impressive. But even in this seemingly ordered, pious society, there were tensions, right?
Yeah.
Did that initial religious intensity last?
It began to fade over time. As the population grew and spread out onto more distant farms, that tight-knit community feeling started to fray. People became perhaps more focused on worldly matters.
And the church leaders noticed.
Oh, they definitely noticed, and they were worried. This led to a type of sermon called the Jeremiad.
Jeremiah, like the prophet Jeremiah.
Exactly. These were fiery sermons where ministers would scold their congregations for their waning piety, their lack of religious zeal, the declining number of people experiencing the profound conversion experience necessary for full church membership.
Trying to scare them back into devotion.
Essentially, yes. And to address the membership issue more structurally, they came up with something called the Halfway Covenant in 1662.
Halfway covenant. Sounds like a compromise.
It was. It was a formula designed to keep people connected to the church, even if they hadn't had that full, intense conversion experience that their parents or grandparents might have had.
How did it work?
It allowed the children of baptized members, even if those members weren't yet full communicants themselves, to be baptized. It gave them a sort of halfway status in the church.
So it broadened the church's reach, but maybe diluted its original intensity.
That was the effect, yes. It kept membership numbers up, maintained the church's social influence, but it definitely blurred the lines between the truly elect, those believed to be saved, and the rest of the community. It signaled a shift away from the exclusive spiritual purity of the founders.
And this period of sort of spiritual anxiety and social change, does that connect to the Salem witch trials?
It absolutely does. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 are arguably the most dramatic expression of these underlying tensions.
What exactly happened there?
It started with a group of adolescent girls in Salem Village who began accusing certain older women, often social outcasts, of witchcraft. The accusation snowballed, panic set in, and a special court was convened.
And people were actually executed.
Tragically, yes. 20 people, 19 hanged, one pressed to death along with 2 dogs. It was a horrifying episode of mass hysteria.
Was it just religious fanaticism, or were there other factors?
The sources suggest it was much more complex than just religion. It also reflected deep social and economic resentments. Many of the accusers came from the poorer, more traditional, agrarian parts of Salem Village.
And the accused.
A significant number of the accused were women connected to Salem town's emerging market economy, merchants' wives, property owners. There seems to have been this underlying tension between the older subsistence farming way of life and the newer, more commercial, individualistic path.
So the witchcraft accusations became a way to lash out at these social changes. A scapegoat.
It certainly looks that way. It was an irrational outburst fueled by fear, superstition, and simmering social conflict. The hysteria eventually burned itself out in 1693 when the governor, supported by more rational clergy, intervened and stopped the trials.
A dark chapter for sure. Now, zooming out slightly, let's talk about the New England economy. You mentioned it wasn't based on big cash crops like tobacco.
No, the land just wasn't suited for it. The soil was often thin, rocky, grudging, as the sources call it. Farming was mostly for subsistence.
So what did they do instead?
They diversified. They developed what became known as Yankee ingenuity. They turned to the sea. Shipbuilding became a major industry. Commerce and trade flourished in port cities like Boston. And fishing, especially cod fishing, was incredibly important.
Cod fishing? Really?
Yes. They called cod the gold mines of New England. Dried, salted cod was a valuable export, particularly to feed the enslaved populations in the West Indies. This environment fostered thrift, resourcefulness, maybe a certain sternness, too.
Okay, so we have these two very different regional portraits. If we try to connect them back together, what's a unifying theme from this whole period?
I think a major theme running through both regions is class tension. Even though colonial America offered more opportunity than Europe for many, there was still a constant struggle over social hierarchy.
People brought old world ideas about status with them.
They absolutely did. Colonists weren't typically from the highest aristocracy, nor usually the very poorest back in Europe, but they tried to recreate familiar social structures. The planter elite in the South is one example.
But these structures were unstable.
Very unstable. We already talked about Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia as a major class conflict, but there were others too. Maryland had a Protestant uprising against its Catholic proprietors, and in New York there was Leisler's Rebellion between 1689 and 1691.
What drove Leisler's rebellion?
Similar dynamics. It pitted aspiring merchants in the lower classes against the wealthy, landed elite who dominated the colony. It was fueled by resentment over privilege and access to power.
So attempts to impose rigid class lines often failed.
They were constantly being challenged. You even had laws, like in Massachusetts, trying to dictate who could wear fancy clothes, like banning poor people from wearing gold lace.
Seriously, sumptuary laws.
Yes. But ultimately, these efforts were pretty feeble. The American environment, the availability of land, even if contested, the distance from established European hierarchies, it all worked to erode rigid stratification.
Creating more of a sense of equality.
Yeah, a certain kind of equality, yes. A spirit of democracy and opportunity was definitely brewing. But, and this is the crucial caveat the sources make, this was primarily equality and democracy, at least for white people. The foundation was being laid simultaneously for both freedom and profound race-based unfreedom.
That's a powerful summary. So to recap for everyone listening, we've traced the harsh beginnings of the Chesapeake, the labor crisis that led from indentured servitude to Bacon's Rebellion, and then the deep institutionalization of chattel slavery based on race. And we've contrasted that with the development of New England, its healthier environment, stable family structures, emphasis on religion and education, town meetings, but also its own internal tensions leading up to the Salem crisis.
Yeah.
Two very distinct societies emerging from common English roots.
Absolutely. And if we circle back to that pivotal shift, the move from indentured servitude, a class-based form of unfreedom, to chattel slavery, a race-based one, it really prompts a deeper question.
What's that?
We saw it was, in large part, an economic and political decision by the white elite to resolve class conflict among themselves. By drawing that stark line based on color, they solidified white solidarity across class lines, but at the horrific cost of permanent hereditary bondage for Africans. So the provocative thought I'd leave you with is this. If the immediate solution to internal white conflict was to institutionalize racial slavery, what does that tell us about the foundational priorities in early America? Was social stability for the dominant group valued more highly than the abstract principle of human liberty itself right from the start?
That is definitely something heavy to mull over, thinking about the deep roots of the American experiment. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.